Well, as you mentioned, I was born on 26th of March 1938 in a southern suburb of London, Camberwell. We were living, my parents were living at the time in a place called Upper Norwood, which is just outside the southern boundary of London proper, but it's essentially part of London. My family was I suppose you'd call it a sort of middle class family. My father was a school teacher, so I grew up for the first. Yes, then it gets a little complicated, because when I was, how old? Just trying to think. Actually, when I was about 18 months old, I guess, we had to move because of the war. I was born in March of 1938, so in the autumn of 1939, we had to move. We were evacuated from London, as many other families were. We moved to a place called Englefield Green, which is near Windsor, on the far western outskirts of London. In fact, Englefield Green really is just about the far western edge of the London conurbation. If you go to the east of there, you basically have houses all the way up to central London. If you go to the west, it very rapidly turns into countryside. So we're right on the edge of the countryside. And my father got a job teaching in a school close to Englefield Green. I went to the local Catholic parish school. I should say my family were Catholic, and so we were brought up as Catholics. And I went to the local primary school, which was maybe, 500 meters from my home, I suppose. And I guess we really didn't know much about the war. We didn't really experience the war very much for the next few years. By and large, we didn't get much in the way of bombing. Some of the towns around us got quite badly bombed, but we didn't. We did know vaguely that something was going on. We children would lie in bed at night and hear the bombers and the V2s and so forth going over, but we really weren't conscious of it very much. And in fact, I still remember that I was only officially told, as it were, that there was a war on. It must have been about 1944, in the very last years. And so I have to say, to be honest, we didn't really experience much of the pain and disruption that many people, for example, in central London, experienced. Well, as I mentioned, my father was a school teacher. His family came from a village in Hampshire, which is a county to the southwest of London. And I guess his family had traditionally been village cobblers, that is, shoe repairers. His father had changed his trade and become a market gardener. That is, he grew vegetables for the market. My mother her parents were both Irish, and in fact my grandmother, well, both my grandmother and my grandfather were born in Ireland. I know more about the history of my grandmother on my mother's side. She was born in Dublin of a family which I think had once been fairly well off, but had fallen out of wealth. And by the time she was born, they were fairly poor, and so she was actually sent out as a housemaid, domestic servant, already at the age of 12. So she didn't get any high school education. Sometime, I think probably in her late teens or early 20s, she emigrated to England. In those days, of course, Ireland was still under British rule and English rule. And there she met my grandfather, who was a clerk at the naval base in Chatham. And so she, as I say, she never had a high school education, but she's a very interesting person and very adventurous also. She actually, this is much later, but she actually immigrated to Australia in her 60s, I think, and then later came back and spent the rest, came back in her 70s and spent the final years of her life back in England. So I didn't see that much of her in person, but we did write to one another quite a bit, and I was really very fond of her. As to my siblings, my brothers and sisters, I was the eldest of 5 children. I had a sister, Claire, who was a year younger than me. Then a brother who was 2 years younger than Claire. A brother, Terence. Brother Paul, who was maybe 3-4 years younger again. And finally, my youngest sister, Judith, who was about 10 years younger than me. Of those, in fact, Paul, unfortunately, died in his early 20s from some kind of stomach problem. Terence lived into his 50s, but then died of leukemia. And my 2 sisters, Claire and Judith, they're still alive. My sister Claire lives in Oxford in the UK, and my sister Judith lives in the US in San Diego. Well, one of the most important things about our family, I think, is that they were, as I mentioned, they were Catholic. Of course, my mother coming from Ireland, it was natural for her to be Catholic. But in my father's case, I think this is a bit of conscious choice of his own father. I think his father had converted. I never knew my paternal grandparents because they died before I was born. But I guess he'd converted. And this meant that in those days, Catholics were really a pretty small fraction of the English population. I guess probably 1.5%, something like that. So we really felt rather consciously out of the mainstream. And I think the fact that I was always conscious of that was some kind of factor in my psychological development. So yeah, as I say, the very first school I went to was a Catholic primary school in Englefield Green. I remember a few things about that school. One of them was that I was rather precocious, and I used to confuse, I think, some of my teachers. I'm just trying to remember. Yeah, I think on one occasion the teacher asked the class, each of us in the class, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I told her that I wanted to be a cartographer. And she said, well, what's that? So I had to explain that it meant someone who makes maps. In fact, I was extremely keen on maps in my very early years. But I didn't stay very long at that school because after the end of the war, we moved back to the southern edge of London, to Upper Norwood, and then I went to a different Catholic primary school. I don't have too many memories of that school, to be quite honest. I don't actually think I was terribly happy there because I was too precocious and I tended to get bullied a bit. Not seriously, but I was not the most popular person in the class. One thing I remember about that period, we're talking now about the years, I was about 7 until 10, 7 to 9 or 10, I got very interested in chess and became quite good at it. And I do remember that I think it was then, probably when I was about 9 years old, there was an occasion when a Russian chess grandmaster visited England, and for some reason he visited our area. I really can't imagine why, because it's nothing special about our area, but he did visit our area, and he played a game of simultaneous chess with a group of people who were mostly adults, but they included me as well, about 50 of us. And I was actually able to score a draw in that game. And this apparently made the local papers and made me mildly famous for a day or two. But to be honest, apart from that, I don't really have any very strong memories of that particular period. After that, when I was 9 or 10, I guess, I took the examination, which was called the 11 plus. So most people took it when they were indeed 11 years or somewhat older. But and this was an examination in the British system in those days, which basically streamed people into various streams. You could go into, if you did well in the exam and you were deemed to be academically able, you went to a grammar school. If you were not so good but didn't have any special aptitudes, you tended to go into so-called secondary modern school. And if you had some technical aptitude and wanted to train in some special skill, then you went to a technical school. I did well in this examination, and therefore I was qualified to go to a grammar school. Again, naturally, it was a Catholic grammar school. It was called the College of the Sacred Heart, and that was in Wimbledon, which is another suburb of southwest London, outside the London boundary. And actually, to get there from our home in Upper Norwood was a quite complicated journey. I had to walk a few hundred yards, take a bus down to Streatham Station, take the train for a few stops across southwest London to Wimbledon, get off at Wimbledon, and either you usually, I think, take a bus for a couple of kilometres maybe, and eventually walk the final few hundred yards. So this is quite a complicated journey. I tried actually many years later, perhaps when I was in my 50s or even 60s, I happened to be back in that area of London, and for some reason tried to retake this journey, and I just got totally lost. So I obviously had no very firm memory, or maybe the transportation system had just changed. I don't know. Anyway, so again, Catholic grammar school, started learning things like Latin, maybe even Greek, I think. I don't remember exactly. Played a few sports, I remember I used to go in quite a bit for long distance running, a mile run, and so forth. But again, no very sharp memories of that time. I don't think anything particularly dramatic happened. I wasn't there very long because after I had been going to the school for a year, 18 months or so, we moved again. My father got a job. He had been teaching at a secondary modern school in northwest London, which involved a commute right across London during rush hour, and that was not really so good. He managed to get a job at a school called Beaumont, and Beaumont was what in Britain is called a public school, but in the US would be called a private school. It's basically a fee-paying school. My father, as they got a job there, and we would never have been able to afford the fees to go to for me or my brothers to go to that kind of school. But he made it a condition of his appointment there that we should all go to the school free. So I and my two brothers were transferred to Beaumont. Beaumont, even among public schools in England, was rather unusual. It, of course, was Catholic, but it was more than that. It was Jesuit. While some of the teachers at the school, like my father, were lay people, a lot of them were not. Many of them, in fact, were Jesuit priests. It's a tradition, or at least was in Britain in those days, in the Jesuit order, that they move you around. And so you might spend some years being a school teacher, but then you go off and perhaps be a missionary or be a parish priest or perhaps even be a university teacher. And this actually was to play a major role in my career, this circumstance. So I was very much a fish out of the water at Beaumont. I first of all, because most of the boys were fee-paying, that meant they came from families which were considerably better off than we were, and so they had a sort of home life which is a bit different from ours. Perhaps really that wasn't the most important thing. I think there were two other things which were very important. One was that because of my apparent academic precocity, I was put into a class where most of the boys were a couple of years older than I was. And this was already somewhat disorienting. But the other thing was that for most of my time at Beaumont, and I actually spent a total of probably 6 years, I think, 5 or 6 years there. For most of my time at Beaumont, I was a so-called day boy. That meant that unlike most of the boys who boarded, that is, they stayed continuously at the school, slept there, and so forth. I actually commuted into the school by day and came back home in the evening. And again, that made me that cut me out of some of the activities of the school and made me feel very definitely not 100% part of the community and so forth. So I didn't. I think really I wasn't that happy. I wouldn't say I was unhappy, but I didn't feel particularly happy at Beaumont. One point was that this is going to sound, I think, rather surprising to many people. It was a peculiarity of the British school system in those days, not just Beaumont, but more generally. It was a peculiarity that they had a very strong streaming system. There was, for example, the classics stream where you studied Greek and Latin literature. There was the modern languages stream, French, German, etc. There was the mathematics stream, and finally the science stream. And you are basically put into one of these streams at, well, for most people it would have been the age of 15. But for me, since I was 2 years ahead of most of my classmates, it was actually at the age of 13. So at the age of 13, I, or more precisely my parents really, had to make the choice of which of these streams I would go into. Normally speaking, this would have almost pretty much determined my career in life. Because what you majored in high school determined what subject you were likely to study at university. And again, everything was very rigid in those days in Britain. What you studied in university would be a very strong influence on what you actually ended up doing in life. So my whole career at first sight was pretty much determined by that choice at the age of 13. Now, my father, as I said, was a school teacher at the school. His subjects he taught were physics, chemistry, and mathematics, but he never actually pressed me to go into those subjects. In fact, in those days, the science stream was regarded as the least prestigious of all the four streams. Basically, the most prestigious was classics, the next was modern languages, the third was maths, and the fourth was the sciences. We're talking, you have to remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about the early and mid 50s. I think I would have started at Beaumont in, I think, 1949, and I stayed there until 1955. So we're talking about the early 50s, basically. And so, since indeed classics was the most prestigious stream, and I seemed to have no particular ambition to do anything else, I was pretty much automatically streamed into the classics. And so I ended up spending quite a bit of my school hours on Latin and Greek languages and literature. We did do other things. We certainly had classes in history and some modern languages, including French and German, which later turned out to be quite useful for me. And we even had some mathematics, but not much. I don't actually remember exactly how much math I did. I'm fairly sure, so I certainly did algebraic geometry. I remember doing that. I probably did differential calculus, but I can't be quite sure. And I'm fairly sure I didn't do any integral calculus. So the math was really pretty basic in some sense. Two things actually, two events which I think were really rather influential in my life happened during my years at Beaumont. One was that, for some reason connected with my health, I think I'd had some kind of throat problem, and my father thought I ought to convalesce in some kind of healthy climate or whatever, or at least get some fresh air. And I was actually, I was a member of the Boy Scout troop at school, and it turned out that the Boy Scouts actually had a little station in North Wales where they brought in Boy Scouts from all over England and Wales, and they gave us some basic experience in mountain hiking and even, I think, possibly a little rock climbing. I don't remember. I think probably just mountain hiking. And so my father, at some point, this must have been towards the end, I think, of my stay at Beaumont, so I would have been, I don't know, 14, 15, something like that. He sent me to this, for a week, to this place. And I really loved those mountains, and I still do. North Wales is still one of my favourite places in the world to go. The mountains seem pretty trivial by, say, continental European or North American standards. They're never more than about 1,000 meters, but they're tough. You don't want to trifle with them. And I learned to respect those mountains and to love hiking them, and eventually later when I got to university, actually climbing, doing rock climbing and so forth. So I think that was one very life-changing experience I had in Beaumont. The other one was somewhat more serendipitous in a way. I mentioned that that many of the teachers at Beaumont had not been school teachers all their lives. They had other things. And apart from that, it turned out that the one or two retired Jesuits who were living there. Basically, I mean, they had to live somewhere, so they lived at Beaumont. And one of these people was a priest called Father Charles O'Hara. And he had actually been, at one point in his career, had been a professor of mathematics at a small Irish university. And he had written a rather well-regarded book on a particular branch of mathematics. After I had applied for and received a scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford, in December of 1954, I really was rather a loose end. In those days, there was nothing corresponding to the Peace Corps or the British equivalent. I did apply for one or two odd jobs, but was not successful. And so basically I stayed at school, but really was kicking my heels. And one day, as I was walking along the corridor, I ran into Father Charles O'Hara, and he said to me, "I have the impression you have a bit of time on your hands." And I said, "Yeah, you can say that again." He said, "Well, so happens I have some time on my hands. Why don't you come along to my room for a couple of hours a week, and I will tell you some interesting things about modern mathematics." Now, as I'd mentioned, I'd had very little formal mathematics in my schoolwork. I had no particular interest or idea that this was going to be particularly useful to me, but he seemed enthusiastic, so I thought, why not? So I went along to his room for a couple of hours a week, and he told me all sorts of fascinating things about groups and rings and fields and so forth. You should not ask me today to explain the difference between a ring and a field, but at the time I thought I understood it. What was, I think, really valuable was that he actively encouraged me to do a few simple exercises in modern mathematics. And my first thought was, well, why should I bother? It's never going to be any use to me. But I decided I would try, and to my great surprise, I found not only that I actually seemed to be able to do these exercises, but that I actually rather enjoyed doing them. That happened, as I said, during the last two semesters of my stay at Beaumont. At the end of the year, I went up to Oxford, to Balliol, and essentially forgot about it. But it was to play a very crucial role in my future career. One or two other things that I also developed. I did continue my interest in chess, and actually was fortunate enough to be selected to represent England in the under-16 Glory Cup against Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Apart from that, there were not, I think, too many notable things that happened during those years. I don't remember whether the scholarship that I received from Balliol formally committed me to doing a particular course there. Probably not, I think, but it seemed very natural since I had specialised in Latin and Greek literature at language and literature at Beaumont. It seemed very natural to start the so-called Greats degree at Oxford. This is one of the many things in the British educational system which really can't be understood on a logical basis. They have to be understood on a historical basis. So the Greats degree had developed over literally, I think, hundreds of years. And the way it worked was that for the first 5 trimesters, it was a four-year course, so 12 trimesters. So for the first 5 trimesters, you studied Latin and Greek languages and literature. And this is pretty intensive, actually. We were expected by the end of that course to be able to compose poetry in in classical Greek and so forth. Then for the last 7 trimesters of the course, you studied a mix of ancient history, and again, ancient meant Greek and Roman history, and philosophy. The philosophy that you did in this course was essentially modern. It was much the same as you would have done had you been taking a major in straight philosophy at some other British university. I embarked on this course. I enjoyed it a lot. One of the things that I really enjoyed was the fact that we used to be able to, we used to have these small group tutorials. In fact, mostly just 1 or 2, usually 2 people at a time with our tutor. Your tutor would assign you to go away and read some of the most recent literature on the subject. This was particularly true on the philosophy side. And having done that, you could go back and essentially argue on equal terms with your tutor. Or at least that was the impression one got. I mean, it might have been true, but one had the impression that you were actually in a position of being able to argue one-on-one with your tutor. I studied for that degree. At the same time, I took advantage of all the informal intellectual and social activities that were going on in Oxford. Lots and lots of societies organised by the students themselves, which I really enjoyed. At the end of this, I took the final exam, and although it was a pretty stressful experience, I was successful, and I ended up with a first-class degree. But in the meantime, other things had happened which were relevant to my career. As I said, it's a 4-year degree, and as I came up towards the end of my, towards the beginning, I think actually, of my 3rd year, started to dawn on me that I was going to have to eventually settle on some kind of career in life. So, not being terribly imaginative, I looked around to see what the other students who had been taking or were taking this great degree had done with themselves. And I found that in most cases they'd done one of 2 things. Either they'd become academics, or teachers, either at university or at high school, in one of the subjects they studied, that is Latin and Greek languages and literature, ancient history and philosophy, or they got into the British civil service. That was a major source of employment for people with that particular degree in those days. Remember, we're talking now about the mid to late 50s of the last century. I did briefly consider the civil service option, but I rather rapidly concluded that was not something I was particularly cut out for, so I discarded that. So at first sight, at least, this left the option of becoming a teacher of one of these subjects and make my living that way. Of the 3 subjects I'd studied in the Greats degree, the one I'd enjoyed most and perhaps been most successful at was philosophy. I started thinking seriously about the prospect of becoming a professional philosopher. in England, in those days, and I believe even now, philosophy is not a subject which is taught at high school, so it had to be a university job. And so my thought was, well, what I will do is I will, having taken my final degree at the end of my fourth year, I will apply for a postgraduate scholarship in philosophy, and I will eventually write a thesis and so forth, and hopefully on the basis of that I will be able to get a job as a university teacher of philosophy. And somehow, the more I thought about this, the more I realized, first subconsciously and later rather consciously, that actually this was not something I wanted to do. I started asking myself, well, why don't I want to go on to a career in academic philosophy? Well, had I been a little more imaginative, I think I might have asked myself, why do I want to go into any kind of academic career at all? But I had really no experience outside academia, and I was sufficiently unimaginative not to contemplate anything much outside academia. So that meant that academia was okay, but there had to be something wrong with philosophy as a career. And so I started asking myself, well, why is it that I don't really think I would enjoy being a professional philosopher? And the answer I gave myself, rightly or wrongly, was that, at least in those days, as philosophy was practiced in Oxford, it seemed to depend so sensitively on the precise language you used, and even more on the opinion which your colleagues had of your writings. There didn't really seem to be any kind of objective touchstone as to whether what you're doing was good or bad work, right or wrong. I gradually and more consciously came to realize that I wanted to work in an academic subject where there was such a touchstone. In other words, where there's something outside of yourself and your colleagues which would tell you whether what you were doing was good or bad, right or wrong. So the first subject I seriously thought of was mathematics. As I said earlier, I did have at least some small experience of modern mathematics and knew that I'd enjoyed it. And so my first thought was that perhaps I should become a professional mathematician. And then I remember very clearly saying to myself, no, I don't think I want to go into mathematics as a profession. Why not? Well, by the nature of the subject, if you work in mathematics, if you're wrong, it means you're stupid. I would like to be able to be wrong without being stupid. In other words, I would like to make meaningful conjectures about the way the world works, and then try to do experiments or get my colleagues to do experiments to actually find out whether these were right or wrong. And so that's how eventually I came to realize that perhaps I would be happy doing physics. One thing I didn't mention was that I essentially had no experience of physics at Beaumont. This is not technically totally true because after I'd got my Oxford scholarship in December of 1954, as I said, I had lots of time to kill, and one of the ways I tried to kill it was by going along to one of my father's classes. You remember he was a teacher, among other things, of physics. But this was an intermediate level mechanics class. The other students in the class had been doing this stuff for years and years. Really, in my case, it went in one ear and out the other. So I think that really had no effect on my decision to try to do physics. What did, however, have a huge effect was the exposure to modern mathematics, which I had got from Father O'Hara at Beaumont. That gave me some confidence that whatever else I might have trouble with in a physics degree, the mathematical side was probably not going to be part of it. Well, having made that that decision, of course, I had to try to figure out how to implement it. Now you have to realise that in those days it was very unusual to do not one but two undergraduate degrees, still less to do a degree in a subject where you had essentially zero high school experience. So the first thing I had to do was to persuade some college or university to take me for a second undergraduate degree. The way I approached this was by approaching the tutor in theoretical physics at my then college, Balliol. In those days, we're talking now about 1957, 8, 9. In those days, most Oxford colleges did not have a tutor specifically in theoretical physics as distinct from just physics. But Balliol was an exception, and a year or two earlier than that, they actually hired a young Australian physicist named David Brink. As far as I know, he's still alive, who was their first tutor in theoretical physics. And so he was the natural first port of call. He listened to my application, as it were, and then sent me a little test. He gave me, or urged me to get a copy of the book by Courant and Robbins called What is Mathematics? It's a really beautiful book. Mathematics essentially for the layman. And he asked me to go away and read a few chapters of that book. And when I came back, we're talking now about the summer of 58, I guess it must have been, yeah. Over the summer vacation in 1958, I was to read some chapters, and when I came back in the fall, he gave me a sort of mini exam on this material. On the basis of that, decided that yes, I probably could cope with the mathematics that I would need to do a degree in physics. So he persuaded Balliol to offer me the chance of doing a second undergraduate degree in physics. However, that was by no means the end of the story, because the next thing I had to do was to finance myself for this second undergraduate degree. Well, I'd already had 4 years' worth from the British taxpayer. They were not likely to give me another 2 or 3 years. For a reason I'll come to, it had to actually be 2 years. However, there's a second college, Merton, which had a set of scholarships which they normally awarded for postgraduate study. But I think David Brink got in touch with the tutor at Merton, who was Michael Baker. He is now deceased. He died about 3 years ago. Michael Baker persuaded the Merton College to offer me one of these postgraduate scholarships to do a second undergraduate degree in physics. So that solved the financial problem. It's very generous of Merton. However, the third problem was the worst one, and that was the military draft. In those days, Britain still had, following World War II, Britain still had the military draft for all male citizens. Now, I had been able to postpone that at the age of 17 by going up to Oxford for my first undergraduate degree. That was quite regular. However, I was not going to escape the draft forever, and so I would have normally been drafted at the end of my first degree in 1959. But now there was a special feature. It was widely known that 1959 was going to be the last year of the draft in the UK. So if I go to my draft board and say, look, you guys, you've already deferred me for 4 years. Because I want to do a second undergraduate degree, I would like you to defer me for another 2 years. And they would look at me and say, we know what you're playing at. You want to get out of the draft altogether, which is, of course, true, but not the main point. So my prospects of avoiding the draft, and therefore a severe dislocation to my proposed scheme of study, at first sight would have looked very slim. However, then there was something really serendipitous which happened, or by that time had happened. Namely, in I think November of 1957, the then Soviet Union had put up the first Sputnik, first artificial Earth satellite. Everyone in the world could see this thing going put, put, put across the sky, and they knew that it was not the supposed technological front runners, the United States or the UK, which had put up this object. It was the Soviet Union. And so, of course, there was immediately an enormous outcry from all the pundits and journalists and politicians and so forth. How come that the Soviet Union has managed to get ahead of us in this incredibly important technological enterprise? And they very soon came up with the answer. It's because we've allowed all our best and brightest people to study useless subjects, not like classics, and not useful subjects like physics. And so immediately there was a surge of encouragement of people who had been working in an art subject to transfer into science. I actually managed to catch the crest of this wave. And so my tutors at Baylor were able to go to my draft board and argue, look, this is exactly one of these guys whom you've wanted to convert from arts into science. But if you now draft him, it's going to totally screw up this possibility. So sure enough, they made this argument and they were successful, and the draft board did indeed allow me to not to be drafted, but to go on and continue to a second undergraduate degree. And so really, I think, all these different bits of serendipity which came together and enabled me to go on and eventually get the career that I wanted to. So I went on to do a physics, a second undergraduate degree in physics at Merton College, under the general guidance of Michael Baker, whom I mentioned. And this was a rather peculiar experience because I had to basically cram into just 2 years. I should say that in order to get a classified degree in my second subject, physics, I had to complete it to be 6 years from entering the university, which meant I had to complete my physics degree in 2 years rather than the usual 3. So I had to try to cram into 2 years what most people would have learned over a 4 or 5 year career at high school and then a 3-year undergraduate career at university. And so I did get a severe amount of indigestion. I remember that at one point I was simultaneously studying standard intermediate mechanics textbook. I think it's called Humphrey and Topping Intermediate Mechanics, all about blocks sliding on slopes and pulleys and things like that. And at the same time, I was actually trying to learn quantum mechanics from Mandel's book on the subject. So I did get a fair amount of intellectual indigestion, but I did manage to cope with the course. One of the things that I think did surprise and in some sense perhaps disappoint me, although it's a very natural feature of the subject, was that unlike in the Greats degree, you could not now in doing an undergraduate degree in physics argue with your tutors on any kind of equal footing. The subject was huge. It had developed in a systematic way over 300 years or so, and there was just an awful lot you had to learn before you were at the frontiers. And so that was quite unlike the situation in philosophy or ancient history. But, I coped with that. Eventually, I had to take the final exam, and that was nearly a major disaster. I did very badly on the first paper and really thought I was going to flunk it completely, but I did manage to recover. And at the end, I got a so-called vivat first. That is, I I had to undergo an oral examination to see whether I'd be classified between the first, or what eventually it turned out between the first and second class, but I did eventually get classified in the first class in physics. And that was a major relief, because it meant that I then qualified for a government scholarship to go on and do a postgraduate degree in physics. Having applied for and got a government scholarship to do a postgraduate degree that was normally for 3 years, I then had to decide what subject, first of all, what university, what subject, what advisor. As to what university, that really was hardly a decision I had to make, because I was convinced that because of my very unorthodox history, it was extremely unlikely that any university other than Oxford would look at me. So I really didn't hardly thought about applying outside Oxford. So then I looked around at what was going on in the Oxford physics department. In those days, there were really three major areas of study which were being conducted. What was that in those days called, I think, particle physics. Nowadays it would probably be called high energy physics or nuclear physics. The study of, well, as the name implies, of elementary particles and their properties. There was what we called in those days nuclear physics, which nowadays would be called low energy nuclear physics. That is the study of complex nuclei and their properties. And finally, there was what we called solid state physics. Nowadays it'd be called condensed matter physics. So I took a very brief look at these fields. Low energy nuclear physics really didn't appeal to me, despite the fact it was actually the topic of my original contact, David Brink. Incidentally, I should just mention that although I did my undergraduate degree in physics at Merton College, as I mentioned, they didn't have a tutor in theoretical physics as such, so I was sent back to Balliol for that, and to David Brink, who had in fact been the gatekeeper for my career. So that was quite a nice arrangement. Although he was very good and very inspiring, it didn't seem to me that his area, low energy nuclear physics, was particularly exciting at that time. As to particle physics, I took some advice on that, and we're talking now about the spring of 1961, I guess. And I was potentially given the advice by people who knew something about that area that particle physics was in the doldrums. There was nothing really exciting going on. That was true at the time. Had I been able to wait for another 6 months, things would have been quite different, because that was just the time at which the so-called Eightfold Way came in and more or less upended particle physics. At the time when I had to make the decision, that was not the case, so that again didn't seem particularly exciting. That left by default condensed matter, or solid state physics. And so that's where I decided that I would go. I, of course, also had to make some decision between theory and experiment. For me, again, that was really no choice, because I'd never considered myself to be particularly good with my hands and so forth. I'd done a little sort of routine experimental lab work during my undergraduate degree, but I hadn't particularly enjoyed it or found it particularly interesting. So I thought, yes, I would go into theory. Again, it was pretty unlikely that most theoretical physicists on the faculty at Oxford would look at me, because I had this very unusual career. I didn't have the usual background at all. There was one person who had made a more or less a practice of taking high-risk students, and that was Dirk ter Haar at Magdalen College, a third college. Dirk was an interesting character. He was Dutch, and had done his own thesis under the mentorship of Hendrik Lorentz, I guess. Then, immediately after the war, he'd moved to Britain and eventually ended up in Oxford. And so his philosophy was basically that he would take on basically almost anyone who applied, but then you really had to fend for yourself. He was not going to give you a lot of help, and it was up to you to sink or swim. That appealed to me, and so I applied to him, and he did take me. And indeed, I did have to sink or swim by myself. He really didn't give me a lot of day-to-day guidance at all. Yeah, I should say he was extremely good on the administrative aspects of being a great graduate supervisor. He made quite sure that I got adequate financial support and that I filled in all the forms on time and so forth. But as to the physics, well, as I say, I really had to do that for myself. And so I ended up eventually doing my thesis in two parts. One of them was on the theory of interacting phonons in liquid helium, superfluid liquid helium, or in insulating solids. And the second half was on dilute impurities of helium-4 in helium-3. That was a bit of in some sense, a bit of a mistake in retrospect. In the early 60s, which is what we're talking about, the situation with regard to liquid helium was that it was known that at high temperatures, a mixture of the two isotopes of helium, helium-4 and the rare isotope, helium-3, could coexist. What was not known was whether, as you went to low temperatures, they could still exist. That is, whether a small solution, a small amount of helium-4 would be stable in helium-3, or vice versa, of helium-3 in helium-4, or both or neither. I guessed wrong, in fact. It turns out that at low enough temperatures, indeed a small amount of helium-3 is stable in helium-4, but not vice versa. And I had chosen vice versa for the second half of my thesis, so that did not make a big splash. So eventually I wrote my thesis. It was accepted, and I got my DPhil, the British equivalent of a US PhD degree. Following my postgraduate PhD or DPhil in physics, I actually had 3 years of sort of globe hopping. As a postdoc, I went to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign for a year to work with David Pines. I went to the University of Kyoto in Japan under the formal sponsorship of Professor Takeo Matsubara, and I had a year of just moving around various places for short terms. And then in the fall of 1967, yes, I got a position at the University of Sussex in the fall of 1967. The University of Sussex was one of the so-called plate glass universities. In Britain, universities are or were usually sorted into 3 groups. There are the very few, what you might call British equivalents of the Ivy League. That is Oxford and Cambridge, which of course have been around for hundreds of years. There are the so-called red brick universities, which were mostly founded in the 19th century. Lots of well-known places like Manchester, Durham, Birmingham, and so forth. And then there are the plate glass universities, which were a new group which were founded in the 50s and 60s in the UK. And some of these universities, and in particular Sussex, prided themselves on doing things a bit differently. They tried to be more interdisciplinary than the traditional red brick universities. And Sussex, I think, in some sense, took this to a bit of an extreme. But I liked this, and one of the first things I did after arriving at Sussex was to make contact with people working in the history and philosophy of science. And so I actually became quite interested in some of the issues which were evolving in those areas at the time. One of the main issues was the so-called Popper versus Kuhn controversy, which very, very crudely, the question and issue was how one should actually look at the progress, or at least the ongoing development of science, and in particular physics. Should one look at it as a sort of steady and rationally developing subject, or should, as crudely speaking, this is the view espoused by disciples of Karl Popper, or should one look at it in terms of periods, these so-called periods of normal science interrupted by violent revolutions, in which the usual criteria for what counted as a good or bad argument and so forth didn't really apply. And again, very crudely, that was the view of the adherents of Thomas Kuhn. And so I got involved in this and other controversies. I gave a number of talks in this area and actually wrote a little essay. In retrospect, I think I rather regret that I didn't publish this essay in any sort of mainline journal. I published it, but I published it in a rather obscure journal, which was published in Nigeria. But in that essay, I did try to make the point that, in particular, there were various other things, other points that I raised in this essay, but one point in particular that I tried to make in it was that the way that philosophers and sociologists of science tend to look at the subject is extremely unrealistic, at least as regards topics like condensed matter physics. What the view that the philosophers and sociologists of science, and not just the Popperians, not just the Kuhnians, but just about everyone professionally working in philosophy of science in those days, the picture they seemed to have was that the fundamental areas of physics were particle physics and cosmology, and that anything else was just basically a deduction from these topics, so that in particular condensed matter physics simply basically started from the Schrödinger equation and just tried to derive everything from that by the process of mathematical approximation. And I tried to point out this was just totally unrealistic, that in fact some of the most important advances in condensed matter physics, or in those days I would say solid state physics, came not at all in this way. They came in much more in formulating intermediate level concepts, like say the idea of a quasi-particle or two fluids in helium, and so on and so forth. And these intermediate level concepts were not in any sense derived from concepts at the microscopic level. I think in retrospect, that, as I say, this article was published in a slightly obscure journal. It didn't make a big splash at the time, but I think in retrospect, it did foreshadow some of the discussions which have gone on much later concerning so-called emergence and related things. So that was one thing I did. It was actually quite an important part of my activity during my early years at Sussex. The other main area, second main area was technical physics. I had carried on my work in that I'd done in my postgraduate degree and postdoc on liquid helium. Wrote various papers, including one on the possibility of superfluidity in solids. And then there was another thing that I started getting interested in, and this was the foundations of quantum mechanics. Until I arrived at Sussex in the fall of 1967, I think I had been pretty much taken the attitude which John Bell ascribed to most of the physics community in those days. He actually has a paper which was written just about the time when I started work at Sussex. And in that paper, he remarks that the average physicist believes that all the problems in the foundations of quantum mechanics have long been solved, and that he will easily understand the solution if he can ever spare 20 minutes to look at it. And as I say, that had rather been my attitude. But one of the people I started to interact with when I got to Sussex was Brian Easley. He was a very interesting character. He started life in low energy nuclear physics and spent some time at the Niels Bohr Institute. But he got disillusioned with that, and at the same time interested in foundational questions. He actually ended up not in physics, but in the history and philosophy of science department at Sussex. And he had been much influenced by the writings of David Bohm and John Bell. And soon after I got to Sussex, he gave a little mini course on the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And this sort of persuaded me that maybe I had been a bit too naive, that the problems of quantum mechanics, and in particular the measurement problem, had not been adequately solved. And so I started to think about that. Although, for a reason I'll come to, I didn't actually publish anything on the foundations of quantum mechanics for quite some years after I'd arrived at Sussex.